It is a hot August morning in 1830, and a crowd has gathered along a dusty track on the edge of Baltimore to watch a machine lose. On one set of rails stands a gray horse, harnessed to a railway car packed with men in top hats. On the other stands something almost nobody in America has ever seen move under its own power. It is a steam locomotive, and it is tiny. The boiler is no taller than a man. People have already started calling it Tom Thumb, after the storybook character no bigger than a thumb, because the thing looks like a toy. At the controls stands the man who built it, a New York glue maker named Peter Cooper, his hands blistered, his face black with soot. Someone gives a shout. The race begins. For the first few hundred yards, the horse pulls ahead. Then the little engine finds its breath. Steam screams from the valves. The wheels bite the iron, and Tom Thumb surges past the horse to the roar of the crowd. It is winning. The machine is actually winning. And then a leather belt slips off a pulley. The blower that feeds air to the fire dies. The flames sink, the steam pressure collapses, and the locomotive coasts to a humiliating stop while the horse trots calmly past to victory. The machine lost, to a horse. And here is the strange part. Within 25 years, that same machine would climb mountains that experienced engineers swore could never be climbed. It would bankrupt the rival that everyone had bet on. It would lay a line of iron all the way from the harbor of the Atlantic coast to the great rivers of the West. The thing that lost the race would go on to win everything. This is the story of the most reckless gamble in early America. The race to build its first true railroad across 350 miles of forest, river gorge, and mountain that no rail had ever crossed. A race against a rival with more money, more experience, and the personal blessing of the President of the United States himself. A race that began on a single morning, when two armies of men broke ground in two different cities to chase the exact same prize. Almost everyone watching knew which side would win. Almost every one of them was wrong. So how did the loser win? Stay with me, because the answer begins in a city that was, at that very moment, quietly watching itself die. To understand why grown men would bet a city's entire future on a machine that lost to a horse, you have to go back a few years, to the autumn of 1825. In October of that year, a cannon is fired in Buffalo, on the shore of Lake Erie. Seconds later, another cannon, posted within earshot down the line, fires in answer. Then the next, and the next. A chain of guns stretches across the whole state of New York and down the Hudson River, each gun firing the instant it hears the one before it. In under 90 minutes, the signal travels more than 500 miles, from the Great Lakes to the sea. It is announcing the opening of the Erie Canal. For New York, it is a triumph. For Baltimore, it is a death sentence. At that moment, Baltimore is one of the largest and richest cities in the young United States. Its wealth comes from a simple fact of geography. It sits closer to the western frontier than any other major port on the coast. So the wheat, the flour, and the furs of the interior flow down through Baltimore on their way to the world. That is the city's lifeblood, and the Erie Canal has just cut its throat. Because the canal does something that sounds impossible. It connects the entire western frontier directly to the harbor of New York by water. A barge can now float a ton of grain from the edge of the wilderness all the way to the Atlantic for a tiny fraction of what it costs to haul it over a mountain road. Overnight, the trade that once moved through Baltimore begins to drain away to the north. The merchants of the city can see their future, and it is empty. So they do the obvious thing. They look at the map and ask, can we build a canal of our own, west to the Ohio River, in the heart of the continent? And the answer the engineers give them is brutal. No. The land west of Baltimore is the wrong land for a canal. It rises into hard ridges and rocky mountains with no easy water route through them. To dig a canal across the Alleghenies would take a level of money and water that simply does not exist. Baltimore is trapped against a wall of stone, watching its rivals float past on either side. And then, into this moment of pure desperation, comes an idea so new that most people have never even seen one: a railroad. Not the railroads we know, but the rough beginnings of the thing, a few short experimental lines in the coal districts of England, where iron rails carry heavy wagons. A small group of Baltimore merchants and bankers gather in a private home in the winter of 1827 and make a decision that sounds, to most people of the time, completely insane. They will not build a canal, they will build a railroad. Not a short line to a mine, but a railroad reaching 350 miles west, over the mountains all the way to the Ohio River. Nothing like it exists anywhere on Earth. On the 28th of February, 1827, the state of Maryland grants them a charter for a company with a name that states its impossible ambition outright: the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. A line from the city to a river it cannot yet reach, to be built with a technology that barely exists. But Baltimore is not the only city that has read the map and felt the fear. Down in Washington, powerful men have their own plan to reach the West, and theirs is the safe one. They will build a great canal up the valley of the Potomac River, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, and they have something Baltimore does not. They have proof. Canals already work. The Erie Canal is making New York rich at this very moment. They have the backing of the federal government, and they have the support of the president himself. And so the stage is set for the race. And the race begins, almost unbelievably, on a single day. On the 4th of July, 1828, the 52nd anniversary of American independence, both projects break ground at the same time. In Washington, the ceremony belongs to the canal, and it is glorious. The President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, is there in person. There are speeches, there is a boat ride up the river, there is a fine meal for the officials. And then the president takes up a ceremonial spade to turn the first earth of the Great Canal. He pushes it into the ground and it stops dead. He has hit a tree root. He tries again and hits rock. He throws off his coat and tries a third time before the spade finally bites. The crowd cheers. Almost nobody notices the small dark joke in it, that the safe and certain project has, on its very first stroke, struck stone. In Baltimore, the railroad has no president. What it has is an old man. His name is Charles Carroll. He is 90 years old, and he is the last living person to have signed the Declaration of Independence half a century before. To a crowd that newspapers numbered in the tens of thousands, this living relic of the founding lays the first stone of the railroad with his own trembling hands. And afterward, Carroll says something that history remembered. He says that this act, the laying of this stone, is second in importance only to his signing of the Declaration of Independence, if even second to that. Think about how strange that is. A man who helped create a nation believes that starting this railroad may be the most important thing he has ever done. He cannot possibly know whether the thing will even work. Nobody can. Because here is the secret at the heart of the great Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the part the celebrations carefully did not mention. On the day they laid that first stone, not one person in America actually knew how to build a railroad. There were no railroad engineers because there had never been a railroad of this kind to learn on. There were no rules for how steep a hill a train could climb, or how sharp a curve it could turn, or even what the rails should be made of. The men in charge were soldiers and surveyors, doing something for the first time in human history. They sent agents across the ocean to England to study the experimental lines there and bring the knowledge home. And what those agents learned was not entirely encouraging. So the early railroad becomes a laboratory of desperate guesses. The first 13 miles of track, running west out of Baltimore toward a place called Ellicott's Mills, are not worked by steam engines at all. They are worked by horses, plodding along beside the rails, pulling the cars. For a while, the company even experiments with a car driven by a sail, a wind-powered wagon that actually carries passengers on a breezy day until the wind dies and leaves them sitting still on the tracks. This is the cutting edge of American transportation in 1830, a horse and a sail. And yet, even with horses doing the pulling, the men building the line are doing something extraordinary in the ground beneath them. Just outside Baltimore, they have to carry the railroad across a stream valley, and they build a bridge of stone to do it. A single great arch called the Carrollton Viaduct. They build it so well that it still carries trains today, almost 200 years later, one of the oldest railroad bridges anywhere on the planet. The men who did not know how to build a railroad were, stone by stone, inventing how. Now, if you find yourself fascinated by these moments where people gamble everything on a technology nobody fully understands yet, that is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. So subscribe, because the deeper we go, the wilder this one gets. Because there was one problem the horses could hide, but the future could not: the curves. To wind its way out of the river valleys west of Baltimore, the line had to bend in tight curves, far tighter than anything on the gentle railways of England. And the English experts had been clear: a steam locomotive, with its rigid wheels and great weight, could never hold such sharp curves. It would jump the rails. The conventional wisdom of the entire railroad world said that the Baltimore and Ohio, with its twisting American route, would have to be a horse railroad forever. And a horse railroad could never beat a canal across 350 miles. The whole gamble was quietly dying. This is where our man from the opening walks back onto the stage: Peter Cooper. Cooper is not a railroad man at all. He is an inventor and businessman from New York who has bought a large piece of land near Baltimore, partly because the new railroad was supposed to make it valuable. Now he is watching the railroad falter, and with it, the value of everything he owns. But Cooper does not believe the experts. He believes the problem is not that steam cannot turn the curves. He believes that nobody has yet built the right engine to do it. So he decides to build one himself. He builds it small on purpose, light enough to take the curves, just enough to prove a point. He has almost nothing to work with. For the tubes that carry hot gas through the boiler, the story goes, he scavenges old musket barrels. He cobbles the little machine together by hand. It is so small and odd that the men of the railroad laugh at it and give it the mocking nickname that stuck: Tom Thumb. And in that hot August of 1830, Cooper takes his toy out to prove that steam can run on American iron. And it does. It hauls a car full of directors of the company up the line and back, around the very curves the experts said were impossible, and the machine never leaves the rails. The point is made before the famous race ever begins. When the operators of the horse-drawn cars challenge the engine to a race to humiliate it, and that slip belt hands the win to the horse, it no longer matters. Everyone who was there had already seen the truth with their own eyes. They had watched the little engine outrun the horse before the breakdown. They had felt how easily it took the curves. The experts had been wrong. Steam would work. Within a year, the Baltimore and Ohio gave up its horses for good and went to steam. The loser of the race had just won the most important argument in American transportation. But winning the argument was not the same as winning the race, because the rival canal was not standing still. And west of the city, the two enemies were about to collide in a place where there was only room for one of them to pass. The Potomac River, west of Washington, runs through a narrow gorge. In places, the cliffs come down so close to the water that there is barely a ribbon of flat ground along the bank. And both the railroad and the canal needed that same ribbon to push west. There was not enough room for both. At a spot called Point of Rocks, they came to a dead stop, face to face, and went to war, not with tools, but with lawyers. The fight dragged on for 4 years. 4 years in which the great race to the Ohio River slowed to a crawl while judges argued over a strip of riverbank. And in 1832, the court handed down its decision, and the canal won. The judges gave the precious shoreline to the canal. The railroad, the upstart, the machine that lost to a horse, was legally blocked from the easiest path west. For the safe bet, This should have been the killing blow. By every reasonable measure, the canal was now ahead. It had the law, it had the president's blessing, it had proven technology, and now it had the only good route through the gorge. If you had stood at Point of Rocks in 1832, you would have bet everything you owned on the canal. And you would have lost it all. Because the two rivals were not really racing each other. They were racing the land itself. And the land was about to decide the whole contest. West of the gorge rose the Allegheny Mountains. And here the deepest difference between the two technologies finally mattered. A canal is a ladder of water. To climb a mountain, it needs a staircase of locks. And at the top it needs water, vast amounts of water, sitting at the summit to fill those locks and keep the whole thing flowing. And up in those dry mountain ridges, that water simply did not exist in the amounts required. The canal, for all its certainty, was running headlong into a wall of rock and thirst. The very same wall that had stopped Baltimore from digging a canal in the first place. The railroad did not need water at the summit. It only needed a path a train could grip. And so, mile by brutal mile, that is what its engineers built. They blasted cuts through solid rock. They threw bridges across river after river, including the great curving stone Thomas Viaduct, so massive that critics swore it would collapse under the first train, and which stands and carries freight to this day. They learned, as they went, how to drive a railroad through country that had no business carrying one. Every mile was an invention. Every mile was paid for in money the company barely had, and in the lives of men who fell building it. The canal, meanwhile, ground to a halt. It reached the town of Cumberland in the Maryland mountains in 1850, exhausted, deep in debt, and beaten by the cost of the climb. And there it stopped, forever. The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, the safe bet, the president's project, never reached the Ohio River at all. The very name on its banner became a promise it could not keep. The railroad kept climbing. And on the first day of January, 1853, almost 25 years after a 90-year-old man laid a single stone in Baltimore, a locomotive of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad rolled into the city of Wheeling on the banks of the Ohio River. The line was complete. The impossible thing was done. Baltimore was joined to the rivers of the West by an unbroken road of iron, a feat the wisest engineers of 1827 had called a fantasy. The gamble had paid off in full. Now think back to that dusty track outside Baltimore, and the little engine coasting to a stop while a horse trots past to win. For years, that race has been told as a charming failure, the day the machine lost. But that was never what it was. It was the day a New York glue maker proved that the future could run on iron, even around the tightest American curve. The horse won a single sprint. The machine won the century. That, in the end, is the answer to the question we started with. Why did the loser win? Because the men who bet on the canal were betting on the world they already knew, on water, on proof, on the safe and certain path. And the men who bet on the railroad were betting on a world that did not exist yet, on a machine so new it had not yet learned to beat a horse. One side bet on the past, the other side bet on the future. And the future, as it always does, eventually arrived. The canal is a quiet walking path now, its locks empty, a place for joggers and history. The railroad it raced became the spine of a growing nation, and the pattern that Baltimore set in its desperation, iron rails reaching across impossible country, would within a few decades bind an entire continent together from one ocean to the other. It all started because one city was afraid of dying and chose, against every sensible voice in the room, to bet everything on a machine that lost to a horse. If stories like this, where a reckless idea quietly rewrites the world, are the kind of thing you want more of, you are welcome to subscribe and come along for the next one. Because Charles Carroll, the old man with the trembling hands, may have been right after all. Of everything he did in his long life, signing the birth of a nation, and then, half a century later, laying the first stone of the road that would carry it into the future. Maybe the second one really was almost as important as the